What is up, guys? Welcome to my review for The Flash, Season 4, Episode 14, titled Subject 9. And by the way, this episode being called Subject 9 is a little bit lazy, because this episode is called Subject 9, which is named after the Fiddler in this episode. And to call this episode Subject 9 would be very similar to calling literally any episode with a best meta Subject X. Subject 1, 2, 3, 4, and so on and so forth. So to call this episode Subject 9 is incredibly lazy in my opinion, and again, obviously this is not a complaint against the episode. This is just me pointing out that titling this episode Subject 9 is extremely lazy. But moving on to the review, because that doesn't really bother, that's not really a complaint on the episode. Like I said, it's just me pointing out the fact that the title is pretty lazy. So moving on to the review though, it started out with Barry getting fired from his job. Well, more accurately, he was put on leave indefinitely, which is basically kind of being fired, but not really. But him getting fired from the CCBD was the main focal point of the beginning of the episode, and I feel like it was something that the writers just thought they needed to do in order to have the next half of the season, Barry being in the Flash suit the entire time, or maybe a more interesting storyline with him being a private investigator with Ralph, which honestly is pretty interesting actually, thinking about it now. It is changing it up a little, making him a private investigator with Ralph instead of being in the CCBD might be interesting, although he usually, even when he's on the CCBD, he really barely ever showed up, or they barely ever showed him, at least in the last couple seasons. They did a lot in Season 1, but after that, really nothing. So maybe him being a private investigator with Ralph we will have more of those scenes instead of barely any like we did before this whole trial thing, before he was framed for murder. Maybe we will, maybe we won't. I'm really neutral on him getting fired though. I don't really care that much, so I am neutral. But I think that him being a private investigator with Ralph would probably produce some interesting storylines, maybe even probably funny storylines. So I'm neutral, but I'm also kind of interested in where this is going. With this episode being called Subject 9, they did introduce a new bus meta in the Fiddler, and in the comics, the Fiddler is actually male. His name is Isaac Bowen. They changed that up to the Fiddler here being female and being called Lizzie Bowen. Usually, I do have a problem with gender bending or even race bending in these shows, because most of the time there's literally no point to doing it, and this is sort of an exception, but also sort of not. I guess they gender bent her, or him to her, in order for Ralph to have some sort of connection to her, or more of a connection to her, which is understandable, but that in itself felt a little forced, which I will talk about in a second. So, and it wasn't that great. So even with that whole Ralph being affectionate to her didn't really turn out that well. So there was really no point in gender bending the Fiddler. So I do have a problem with this. But at the same time, it's really a character that I've never even heard about until doing research for this episode in a trailer breakdown or a synopsis breakdown, one of the two. So that honestly doesn't bother me as much as it would for a character I have known for a while gender bending, or usually they race bend a lot, and it does bother me. But here it's a character I'd never even heard of, so it doesn't bother me as much as usual. The Fiddler herself in this episode was a pretty okay villain of the week. She wasn't really a villain at all, so I guess she was just a bus meta of the week. That's really what they're doing, because most of them, I said in my trailer breakdown for this video that most of them are bad guys, but thinking about it now, most of them are actually not. So they're not really doing villains of the week. They're doing metahumans of the week, or bus metas of the week, to be more precise. And this bus meta of the week was an okay one. Her powers weren't that interesting. They just really had the same powers as the Canary Cry and also the Silver Banshee's Cry, or right now on Supergirl there's Purity's Scream. So they've really overdone the superpower, and they seem to do it only strictly in females. I just realized that there's no guys with that power, which is a little strange. But so either way, it's not an interesting power at this point on a new character. So this bus meta of the week wasn't that interesting. Also, her personality was very generic. It was just a country music person, or something like that. So she's not the greatest bus meta of the week. And I think I called the fact that she was going to die in this episode. I said that she's not going to join the team, and she's not a bad guy, so there's really nowhere else to go but die. So she died in this episode, which I definitely did call. But the fact that Devoe took over her body does kind of annoy me. I think this is the third body that Devoe has changed into. First, he was in Dominic Lance's body, and then Becky Sharp's body, and now, literally the next episode, he went into what's her name? I literally just talked about it. The Fiddler, Lizzie Bowen's body, and seeing him change bodies rapidly every single episode is tiring at this point. I think they should have done it twice, and then went back to Neil Sandylance. They should have done Dominic Lance, and then Becky Sharp, and then somehow he gets Ralph's powers and is able to shapeshift back into Neil Sandyland. That would be the best thing to do, but instead he changed the body again, and at this point it's really difficult to get invested in Devoe. More so, it's easier to get invested in Marlize at this point, because Devoe keeps on changing bodies, and even though the actors or actresses, more so actresses at this point, try to imitate Neil Sandylands, most of the time they don't do an incredible job, and in this episode it was kind of apparent about that. So he seems like a completely, or not completely, but slightly different character, so it's difficult to get invested in his character. I didn't have a problem with him changing a body twice, but at this point, not being back in Neil Sandylands' body is a little aggravating, and seeing a third body, it's difficult to get invested in Devoe, and I don't think Lizzie was an interesting choice even to have take over Devoe's body, because she's just a really generic character. But even though obviously Devoe's in her body at this point, it's just so they already did the same exact thing with Becky Sharp and to a lesser extent Dominic Lance. So to do it again for the third time is a little annoying. They should have just stuck with those two, and then like I said, he gets stretchy powers or Ralph's shape-shifting powers and goes back to Neil Sandylands, who I think will come back soon. Hopefully sooner rather than later. Hopefully this is the last body change, because I am sick. I'm actually sick of these body changes, especially when it's this like abrupt between the two. There was one episode, Becky Sharp was Devoe for one singular episode. Dominic was like for 3 or 4 episodes, but one episode. What was actually the point? That's something that really, really bothered me about this episode. Something I was actually waiting for this season to introduce is the Cerebral Inhibitor, and this episode was the one to do it. They hinted towards the fact that the Cerebral Inhibitor is the thing that Team Flash will use to take down Devoe back in Season 3 when Savitar said so, or Savitar said something similar to that, and they did acknowledge that in this episode, which was pretty cool. Like, if they didn't acknowledge that, that would have been so annoying, but they did, and the Cerebral Inhibitor turned out to be nothing but a fluke. Not a fluke. It was nothing. It was nothing. They hinted towards it in Season 3, and I thought it was going to be the big thing that they're going to use to take down Devoe, or at least it'll work for a little bit, but it turns out to be nothing. The storyline building up to the creation of the Cerebral Inhibitor was actually pretty entertaining and organic and natural. That's the same thing, but it was pretty good. It was interesting and clever the way they did that. But then it turns out that the Cerebral Inhibitor was nothing. Really, it had no effect on Devoe whatsoever, because she or he used his Kilgore powers to get rid of it. So the fact that Savitar mentioned it is a little weird. Why? It's weird that he would remember that, and that's what he would get out of that room that he mentioned in Season 3. He was in that room and said, the biggest thing I remember from this is that we developed a Cerebral Inhibitor, and it meant nothing in the end. He didn't say that, but why? It's weird that he would remember that. So the fact that the Cerebral Inhibitor turned out to be literally or figuratively nothing is kind of annoying. It's really annoying how they hinted towards it, and it turns out to be absolutely nothing. Last thing to touch on for this review is the forced connection between Ralph and Lizzie. I just realized this. I am ranting a lot for this video. It is a little weird because I actually didn't dislike this episode, But looking at it, there's really nothing great about this episode. The only thing I have to talk about are things I disliked. But I actually quite enjoyed this episode, so I don't know why I'm ranting so much. I will give it a higher score than you'd expect from all this ranting, if you can call it ranting. It's reviewing, but it's negative reviewing most of the time, except for the neutral or slightly positive for Barry getting fired from the CCPD. Most of it was negative, but despite that, I actually quite enjoyed this episode, despite most of it being kind of negative. But Ralph's forced connection to Lizzie was pretty forced. They didn't really have any chemistry. Ralph even said he hates country music, so the connection felt forced in order to make Ralph hate Devoe and want to take him down, which he should want anyway, but it felt like they forced him. In the end, he said, "I'm going to take down Devoe." That really did feel a little forced. His connection to Lizzie and then wanting to take down Devoe because of it, it was a little tiny bit forced. Okay, I know I said that was the last thing to touch on, but I did remember something that I actually did like about the episode, something that this episode introduced and explained, or more so explained than introduced, is that Devoe's lair is actually in a pocket dimension. That was something I was wondering, how is Devoe's lair like hidden under his house or something, but it was explained in this episode that it is in a pocket dimension, which I will not put past Devoe. He could totally do that. So the fact that he did and it was explained like that is actually something I really liked about this episode. It was one of the few things that I could talk about that are positive about this episode. I just wanted to add it in here because I forgot to talk about it. This recording, I'm recording a while later, like an hour after I recorded everything else. But this is one of the only things I could talk about that's positive about the episode. I just really liked the fact that Devoe's lair is in a pocket dimension. So, in conclusion, like I said, I enjoyed this episode so much more than you'd expect from me ranting, but at the same time, the fact that there were so many negative things to talk about is pretty telling to the quality of this episode. It wasn't that great. Also, the fact that this was the episode we came back to after the break was a little disappointing. They probably should have they started the break with this episode, and then ended it with episode 15, which looks to be way better, more intense. Looks to be a much better episode and a much better ender to a break. This episode didn't really do it that well, so I'll give this episode a 7 out of 10. But let me know what you thought about the episode in the comments down below, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Thanks for watching.